Hello, everyone. Now we are going to discuss one of the most important framework or theoretical approach to counseling, and a very popular one. I am sure when I start discussing this will many of the concepts here will sound familiar because we have been using this particularly in your human formation. If you go to some therapeutic centers or counseling and you undergo some psychotherapy, more likely when you are engaging with your therapist, some of the terms are familiar to you that because they use that. Or even in our day-to-day language, we have somehow integrated many of the concepts here. Okay, so I'm talking of the psychoanalytic approach or psychoanalysis, the theory conceptualized by Freud himself. And as we all know, many times now, if you talk about psychology, you can help recalling and somehow connecting psychology to Freud. And why? Because he pioneered so many things, especially in how we do psychotherapy. Okay, let me now go to the point of discussion. Remember, I also shared some links in the Blackboard where you can a simplified explanation to the many terms that we are going to discuss today. The lecture here will talk about many concepts, especially those that are very popular and commonly used in psychoanalysis. And I don't expect that you will become expert in the field of psychoanalysis, but at least you will have an idea on how this is applied in psychotherapy. So that, again, when you start to listen to this lecture, I invite you to start imagining how you are going to make and construct your own role play based on psychoanalytic approach. Okay? And make sure that you make use of some of the concepts here and of course look at the rubrics so that you'll be guided accordingly. Okay, let me now proceed. Freud's psychoanalytic system is a model of personality development. Okay, how we develop as a person. Okay, and for him, there are factors that motivate behavior, psychodynamic factors. Later, we are going to more or less be interchanging psychoanalytic to psychodynamic. No? But oftentimes, psychodynamic is a development, an offshoot, or a more modern interpretation of psychoanalytic or psychoanalysis, the traditional one. So instead of fully strictly using the framework of Freud, there are many new development arising from this one. So, and they have eventually in modern practice, many of them would call themselves and use that theory using the word psychodynamic. So, but more or less, we can be interchanging them. Okay. So the focus of psychoanalytic theory is on the unconscious. Okay, we will be talking about the unconscious. When you start imagining how you are going to do your role play, think of this. Now, when you are engaging with your client, your counselee, think always of the idea of the unconscious. I will be talking about that more in detail later. And Freud has a deterministic view of human behavior. That is, our behavior is determined by irrational forces, things that we do not know consciously or understand. And we are determined by our unconscious motivation. There are underlying motivations that are deep under, buried, and they are determining our human behavior. And also these biological instincts. We will be talking about the id in particular, the drives that pushes us to behave in a certain manner. And because of that, human behavior are based on these unconscious factors, these psychodynamic factors that somehow is buried, most of them under in our unconsciousness. Okay, so also Freud talked about how behaviors develop throughout the psychosexual stages. I am sure you have learned this in your psychology 101, 101. We talked about the different stages, the oral, the anal, the phallic, the genital stages, which are the very popular stage proposed by Freud. Okay, I will try to more or less give some descriptions to these stages. Okay, and again, here, the very goal of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious. Take note of that. Simply means that if you want your client to be healed, help your client to become conscious of his unconscious. So, how do we get there? Okay, let me proceed, and you will more or less have an idea, especially later, on how to get to that unconscious of the client so that change can happen, so that they become more free in their behavior, in how they will act every time we help them to uncover things that are deep, buried deep under their unconsciousness. Okay. You might have heard of libido, okay, and it is equated to sexual energy. Later, this was broadened to life instincts, energy of all life. We have this drive, no, to survive, and these are the instincts that we would like to preserve our human life, or we want to gain comfort, pleasure, all these things, the good things that will make us feel good. Okay, these are all the life instincts. Under that, you find that energy. The negative one is death instincts or the aggressive drives. Somehow, Freud believed that there is that unconscious desire for all of us to have that unconscious desire to harm ourselves or harm others. And you find that when you are angry with someone, you have that uncontrollable, maybe urge to harm your neighbor who has offended you. Okay, there is that unconscious drive of wanting to hurt that person. Or if you are feeling so depressed, there is that unconscious desire, motivation to harm yourself. And so he called that the death instincts, in contradistinction to life instincts. Okay, so these sexual drives, these life instincts, and these death instincts or aggressive drives are important instincts that guide our behavior. Okay? Our behavior are determined by these two drives. And then the goal of life, as I was saying earlier, especially in understanding these life instincts, is to avoid pain and gain pleasure. Okay, now let me, to understand better this idea, we now go to the structure of the personality. And take note that these structure or these components or how do we call that? These segments should not be taken separately. Okay, they are systems somehow interacting all together. The id, the ego, the superego. So we have to take them as a whole. The id is a demanding child ruled by the pleasure principle. So, the goal is to reduce tension, to avoid pain, to gain pleasure. So, this is like the biological desires. Uh, as Freud believed that when a child is all id, no, it's what the child wants is always to get what he wants. No? It's all about getting pleasure, getting something. When you are young, it's all about wanting to be fed, wanting to be nursed by your mother. So it's all in the receiving end. Okay. And the primary source of psychic energy and seat of instincts. Drive is to satisfy instinctual needs. Okay, there are instinctual needs, especially when a child is hungry. It's instinctual to the child to cry and demand for food. No? Something that he has no control of. It's just automatic. That demanding child. And then next is the ego, or the traffic cop, which means that the ego actually is the one that has in touch to the reality. If the id is buried in the unconscious, the ego somehow is the one that is in touch with the reality. Later, we will see the imagery used by Freud when we talked about the iceberg. Remember, no, when we have the saying, the tip of the iceberg. Okay, the ego. So, what is the ego? It is ruled by the reality principle. It is realistic and logical in thinking. It formulates plan of action to satisfy its needs. So it is the ego that measures and somehow analyzes and weighs the id and the superego before it acts on something. So it tries to assess, will I submit myself to my demand, to this demanding child? Or will I listen to my superego who's telling me that I should not be giving in to what my pleasure or to my id? Okay, so the ego is the one somehow trying to weigh things out. So we go to the superego or the judge. It is ruled by the moral principle, which includes moral code and represents the idea. It is somehow like the our parents. Now we have imbibed what our parents taught us when we were children, when we were young. Remember, parents would tell us, "No, don't do that. Very good, you're doing it right." Then you are rewarded. Then you are punished. When you do something good, you are given love. When you do something bad, you are punished and sometimes made feel guilty and inferior, especially when there is dysfunctionality in the family. So here, the superego becomes the representation of the outside world, okay? The moral principle or the society outside. There are norms outside that we are somehow pressured to follow. Okay? So again, the structure, they interact, it's a system. They cannot be taken separately. As to understand this, it has to be taken as a whole. Okay, this is the image of the our consciousness and the unconscious, the conscious and the unconscious part of our mind for Freud. Okay, so remember what I was saying about the tip of the iceberg? It's just the tip of the iceberg. If you look at the iceberg, underneath the surface is a bigger part of the iceberg, submerged. Okay, so we are aware only of the those that is above the surface, fully aware of that. We are conscious of that. But a bigger part of the mind is something that we are not aware of. Those are the drives and the instincts that we have. Okay? And here's another imagery when I talked about the structure of the personality. The ego, again, as I told you, it is the one that is in touch with reality. So it's the one that's conscious. And part of that is also pre-conscious. Uh, and pre-conscious that, you know, there's that level, somehow you begin to understand how also our unconscious operates. And then the superego at the same time. But the id is the one that is really buried underneath. Okay. And the superego, you'll see that part of that is somehow above the surface of the water. So it's also, we are consciously aware of the morals out there. Okay. So we are not totally unconscious of this one. Okay. So except for the id, that which is completely buried under. Okay. So that is the imagery of the human mind. And the bigger part, as you can see here, the id is buried underneath. So you will understand why it's so important to, for Freud, to make the tip of the iceberg grow bigger. No? Nakikita niyo, napakaliit, di ba? So in psychotherapy, for you to help the human person, magkailangan mapalaki natin yung pre-conscious at yung tip na yon. And how to do that? We'll get there. Okay, so the unconscious. What is the unconscious? It cannot be studied directly, but can be inferred by behavior. We cannot see this, we cannot examine this, but through our human behavior, we get to realize that there are many automatic behaviors that we have that is just so instantaneous that we react to situations. Why? Because they are determined by this unconscious thing. Okay? And the larger part of the mind exists below the surface of the consciousness. That's what I was talking about. And as evidence, they are saying, as evidence to the existence of this unconscious, we can look at many of our human experiences, like dreams. No? Try to examine your dreams. No? Sometimes we don't understand them, sometimes we understand them, and they are rich in symbols. Okay, and these for Freud are the are evidences that there is this unconscious part in our mind, and the dreams are way of making that unconscious manifest. That's the word, to make it manifest to us. And so that's why in therapy, dream analysis is part of the psychoanalytic approach. Slips of the tongue. We have this saying, no, yung bang bigla mong nababanggit without you thinking anything, without you thinking otherwise. You have no control it. You just said it, no? And you will be wondering, why did I say that? No? So those are slips of the tongue. So again, you are not aware of that. It's just so automatic that they came out and you were able to say things that you are sorry of. No, bakit ko ba to sinabi sa kanya, no? Hindi man lang ako nag-isip, no? I don't know if you experience that, but I think I would like to believe that many of us do experience it. Or post-hypnotic suggestions. Now, we hear of yung, di ba, yung mga hypnosis na, sa mga movies. No? I haven't seen one in actual practice. No? Pero, di ba, nakikita niyo yung hini-hypnotize. No? Pag na-hypnotize mo isang tao, they say you will be able to draw out many informations that he is not aware of. Okay? Material derived from free association. Parang this is like a Boyabunda, no? I forgot what we call that in his talk show. Where you say a word, then you immediately, without rationalizing, without filtering your mind, you just say it, whatever it is, whether it's silly or funny or embarrassing, but it's important, you just say it. No? Okay? Free association. Material derived from projective techniques. I'm not sure if you had those psychological exams where you're given a picture and then you interpret that or you make a story or ink blots, no? Na yung meron lang mga blots na may mga forms dyan, and then you try to find the symbols and explain or say something about that. Those are projective techniques. Okay, symbolic content of psychotic symptoms, no? Marami, di ba, yung mga many times, no, if you encounter someone who is psychotic or schizophrenic, yung mga nasiraan ng ulo, no? they or yung mga delusional, they begin to speak incoherent things or symbols or words that do not make sense. No? Okay, so these are evidences, at least according to Freud and proponents of psychoanalysis, of the existence of the unconscious. Okay, unconscious processes are at the root of all neurotic symptoms and behaviors. No? Yung mga neurotic behaviors natin, no? um, could explain, no, what's happening in our unconscious. Why is it that it's just so I feel uncomfortable when go to bed? I have to check my doors twice, thrice, to make sure that it's locked. I don't know if you do that, no? Or to keep on checking if I have turned on or off the lights, no? You're sure that you did already, but you have to check it again, no? Okay, so these unconscious processes are at the root of all neurotic symptoms. So buried under our unconsciousness, no, we are driven to behave that way. Something in the unconscious, no, is happening. I think that's what we need to uncover. Okay, so the cure, talking of uncovering, the cure then is to uncover the meaning of these symptoms, these causes of behavior, and repress materials that affect healthy functioning. Okay? So your goal as therapists then is to uncover, why are you always angry with someone who is, for example, who comes to you even though he's not doing anything because he's wearing a colorful dress, and when you see that person, it just ignites or triggers anger, no? Without you understanding why. Okay, so something could be there in the unconscious. No, how to get there? We will talk about that, at least according to this approach. So the cure then, uncover the meaning of all these things, so that we will be able to teach our client how to become freer when they act, and so they will be having more understanding and awareness on why they act in a certain manner. So they will gain some insights to their reactions. They will understand where these are coming from. Sounds familiar? We use that word. Where is that coming from? If you underwent CPE, that is a favorite question. I don't know if they still use that. Well, I think CPE is one form of a psychodynamic approach in doing therapy. Okay, so your work as analyst or your work as a therapist then is to work through the client's need to repeat old patterns. Sounds familiar again? Patterns. In some human formations that we underwent in the seminary, sometimes our therapist will ask us, what is the pattern? Where is the pattern of behavior? Why do you always, again, let me go back to my example. Why do you always have, before you go to bed, have to check your doors? You have checked that already, and you keep on doing that every night. Or why do you have to always, for example, make sure or use alcohol? No? Even before the pandemic, some people would just always wash clean their hands or with alcohol when they touch something. It has become automatic and they have to keep on doing that. Okay, so once you have established the pattern, you will work through that and try to analyze where this behavior are coming from. And the cue again is you are going back and look deep into the unconscious so that your client will have an understanding why he is doing these patterns, okay? Why he keeps on repeating this. Next. One concept that is very important to understand in psychoanalytic approach is the idea of anxiety. Okay, what is an anxiety? It's that feeling of dread resulting from repressed feelings, memories, and desires. Okay, fear. No? fear, no? Fear of when you are in danger. Okay, and sometimes, even though you are afraid that something will happen, many times now our fear are not real. No? Meaning to say there is no real threat, but our mind is telling us there is a threatening situation. So we become anxious. And for the psychoanalytic approach, it is due to the conflict among the id, the ego, and the superego. Okay, that results into anxiety. If our ego, for example, is having a hard time whether to follow the id, the demanding id, but he is anxious because he is afraid, and the superego is telling him not to do it, and he becomes so afraid that if he follows his ego, his id, no, somebody will punish him, okay, or he will be in danger. That's why it's important for him to follow the superego. But there are times that there are people who are more into their id, and then after some time they get caught. Then they realize they are out of control, and then their superego forms that makes them feel guilty, and then anxiety comes in. So that conflict that happens between the id and the ego and the superego results into anxiety. And for Freud, for the psychoanalytic approach, there are three kinds: the reality anxiety, fear of the external world. Anxiety is proportionate to the reality of the threat, meaning to say, somebody has a gun and pointed at you, then you become afraid. Yes, you have to be afraid now because it's already pointing at you. So that is the real anxiety, reality, a real one, real fear. But there is also that neurotic anxiety. That is that you are afraid that instincts will get out of control and cause a punishable behavior. I was saying a while ago that if you don't do this, you feel that you will be punished, even though actually you will not be punished. For example, you are afraid that if you don't go early to the chapel, you're afraid that you might be punished. No? Uh, you might be punished even though your formator is not saying anything or doing anything, but there is that fear that you will be punished for that behavior. Okay? And moral anxiety, fear of one's conscience. If you don't follow your conscience, no, you're just so afraid, no? You feel that you are subjected to that all the time. Okay, so these are the three anxieties according to Freud. And when you are into this anxious situation, what happens? You then use some defense mechanisms to temper that anxiety within. Ego defense mechanisms are coping mechanisms to help us face our fears. No? So they are neural behaviors which operate on an unconscious level. They are so automatic, they operate in the unconscious because they tend to deny or distort reality. No? So that when there is a threatening reality, ego defense mechanisms come in, and that will help us, cope with that. Now, because it tries to deny or distort that. Because if we fully see that as a real threatening situation, then anxiety rises. So it helps the individual cope with anxiety and prevent the ego from being overwhelmed. So in many instances, defense mechanisms are healthy and are helpful. Okay, we need that because we don't want that we become too overwhelmed. We become overwhelmed with what's happening outside, and so it helps us. No, so it has an adaptive value. Okay, the only danger is when it becomes a style of life. Then we end up not facing reality. Okay, we don't want to face it anymore because we are in constant denial. Okay, that's one form of defense mechanism, or we resist. So what will happen? We will not be able to deal with the real life situations anymore. We will be escaping all the time. Okay, I would like you to understand the different types of ego defense mechanism. I will not go in detail, but you check your text. Okay, check your text, see the examples. I might use them in our quiz for you to understand. Some of these are very familiar to you. Repression, that is when you try to repress a painful experience in the past and then you buried it underneath, not so that you don't become conscious of that anymore. Okay, or denial. Okay, but when you are in conflict. Okay, sometimes you hear people say you are on denial. You don't want to admit your fault, or that you don't want to admit that these are your issues. Again, in human formation, we sometimes use this. You are on denial. Or displacement. When you have, for example, you're angry with your formator, and because you cannot show your anger towards your formator, you show your anger toward his pet. For example, my seminarians will get, instead of getting angry with me, they get angry with Poi, my dog. Okay, that's displacement. Sublimation. Some behaviors are not socially acceptable. So instead of releasing it in that direction, like for example, sexual energies, no, you don't want seeing people, having sex in public. So, or always into pornography. So to sublimate that energy, they turn to sports, they turn to planting vegetables, or they exercise. So you sublimate, okay, sublimate that energy. Same thing when you are angry, instead of putting your aggression towards someone, you use sports. Now you play, and then you release it there. Sublimation. Reaction formation. You try to make something negative into positive and more acceptable to the outside world. Projection. I'm sure you're familiar with this term. You don't like for example, you don't want something about a person, but in reality, that which you don't like about that person is also something you don't like about yourself. Okay, you are angry with someone who is, for example, always critical of the works of others, but you yourself is critical. Okay, so you project your issues to the other person. Rationalization. You rationalize, you make something more acceptable, you use your reason to make it sound more beautiful and not really showing your true intentions and motivations. No? You rationalize. Regression, you go back to your past issues in life, you regress. Again, if you underwent some human formation, I think CP uses this term, regression, or even PSI. You go back to your childhood, you regress, you have issues like all of a sudden you like to smoke, you are regressing to your oral stage. Okay? Or intellectualization, identification, all of these. No? You can find this in our textbook. Actually, all of these that I'm talking about, you read the text that I posted on your Blackboard account. Okay, try to get to know them. This can be very, very helpful when you start analyzing, when you start helping your client to understand their unconscious by looking at their defense mechanism. A while ago, I was talking about the stages of development in Freud's psychosexual stages. Okay, in brief, I will discuss this. So there are stages of development that occur from birth through adulthood. Key developmental issues are presented in each stage. In each stage, there is that issue that needs to be addressed. If a child needs are not met during a particular stage, that child will be fixated at that stage and display psychologically immature behavior later in life. Okay, that's why when we look at human development into different stages, What is important is that each stage, the needs should be satisfied so that when they go to the next stage, they are integrated. What happens is that if the needs in the first stage are not met, something wrong will happen on the next stage. So there will be that fixation. And there will be moments where they will have to regression. I was talking about regression. So, in looking at the stages of human development, no, important to note for Freud na kinakailangan stage 1, maayos na kagad. So that you can be healthy and go to the next stage. Then, maayos na uli yun. Kapag kami nangyari sa a certain stage, then problems come in. Okay, so just look at it that way. And there are different stages for Freud. The oral stage, first year, okay, related to mistrust, no, trust and rejection issues, no. So during the oral stage, the baby is always in need of feeding, kaya oral, no, na kailangan kumain siya lagi. And if that is not given, no, there will be some trust issues with the parents, no, that will happen, and that will affect later the person's relationship in adulthood. Okay, that's why it's important that each stage is satisfied, because if not, that will have ramifications in later life. Issues will come out. When you are in adult stage, you realize it's hard for you to trust people. More likely, according to Freud's psychosexual stage, something wrong happened in the oral stage. Maybe your parents were not giving you what you need. Your id was not satisfied. You were not fed well. And so, because of that, you're having issues with your relationship with your friends, with your partners, or with people you encounter from day to day living. Okay? Next, anal stage, related to later personal power issues, power control, ages 1 to 3. What happens during the anal stage? No, you are taught how to poop, no? Toilet training, okay? And there are times when you don't do it right, you are punished maybe, or you are rewarded. Okay, so if this is not satisfied, ito yung sinasabi natin na nagiging, I forgot the term, yung anal retentive, di ba? Yung minsan parang masyadong you want to always make you are so focused on so many details, no? Na to the point na masyado ng cruel, okay? Okay, so yun, in that stage, somehow something wrong happened during that stage when you were maybe being trained by your parents, when you are undergoing toilet training, baka masyado silang stricto, no? They were so demanding that you have to follow certain procedures on cleanliness, okay? Phallic stage, ages 3 to 6, related to later sexual attitudes, no? Ito yung nabubuha na yung time when you get according to Freud, you get attracted, the boy gets attracted to the mother, and later, among other psychoanalytic theories, in the same way, the daughter attracted to the father, no? So kapag nagkakaroon ng mga Oedipus complex, Electra complex, look into that, no? These are very interesting concepts and ideas, and of course, these are being questioned, no? As to whether they are too ano ba to? Too grandiose or too masyadong yung illusions, no? Walang grounding sa reality because they are not seeing any evidences, no, as to research whether these concepts or theories by Freud are really demonstrated to be accurate. Anyway, then latency stage, a time where yung sexuality and sexual urge medyo nawawala. What is important is yung mag-socialize. Huh? And then nabubuhay ulito when you reach age 12 to 60. Okay. The problem here, many of these stages, no, they are so many psychologists now, especially now, are saying that we need evidence to show that this stage is really like this one. Okay, that these needs should be met in this one. Okay, so masyadong biological ang approach. So other theories would say we have forgotten the environment, the ecology, or the culture, uh, because in different cultures they don't follow this stage. Okay. You can look into also Erickson's psychosocial stage of development, but I don't want to discuss more in detail about these stages. However, similarly, in the same manner, it's an offshoot of Freud's idea of psychosexual development. Same in the same manner, stages din siya. The idea is in each stage, the issues should be met, okay, to go to the next stage. Because if not, then there will be regression or there will be fixation in one issue that will later in life surface. Okay, there is a need of addressing that. Have you experienced, no, yung, di ba, yung mga inner child formation, and you are asked, no, to go back to your childhood, you were deprived of toys, and maybe it's good now that because that's why now it's manifesting, there are some issues. So to heal that, you're asked to play again with toys. No? Okay, these are techniques following the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach. Okay, so I will not delve deep into this on your own personal reading. It's good to understand them, I guess. The infancy stage of Erickson, early childhood, preschool age, school age, adolescence, young adulthood, middle age, later life. Here you will see that he is no longer just focused on sexual issues. No, there is that social reality that Erickson tried to infuse, no, in the idea of these stages. But just the same, human development follows development undergoes some stages, no? Stage one, two, three, and four, no, to until they fully develop. Okay. Now let us go back, and I would like again to focus on this one, the psychoanalytic therapeutic process, because this is very important once you start doing your role play. Again, I am not expecting that you will be expert in this approach, but at least you will have some understanding, basic understanding, how this operates. Okay. First, take note always, no, when you make your script, the goal is to make the unconscious conscious. Okay, that is the goal. Because when the unconscious becomes conscious, then what happens? The client becomes freer to act because he begins to understand now why he is behaving like that. It doesn't mean that he will have full control, but at least no, there will be that understanding why these things are happening, and it will take a lot of time. It will take a lot of time. Okay. It doesn't happen instantaneously. So increase decisions based on reality and decrease behaviors based on cravings or guilt. So once you become conscious, no, your behavior will be more based on reality, not so much on whether this is good for me, okay, or because I feel so guilty, that's why I'm doing this. So that idea that you become freer, no? You are not you are not enslaved by your superego or your id. Okay, you become more real. Okay, what will be good for you, and you don't have that guilt. No? The idea is to remove guilt. No? Um, and this later some psychologists also criticize this. No? In now, especially in understanding how we live our moral life, no? The importance of guilt. Na pag nawala yung guilt, medyo nagiging mas problematic. Okay? Deep probing into the past to develop self-understanding. When you do your role play, it's always good to assist your client or when you counsel to look at their past. Go back to their childhood as far as they can remember, okay, so that they can understand why their behavior now is like this. Where are they coming from? That simple question, where do you think this is coming from, can be part of your script. No? Saan kaya nanggagaling ito? Bakit lagi kang galit? Balikan nga natin yung nakaraan mo. Okay, these are some questions that the therapist can ask. When you were young, when was the first time you felt this? No? Specifically with your parents. No? When was the time you first felt angry with them? Okay? Yan. Always probing into the past. No? It goes back always to the past so that they will have an understanding of the now and the present. Okay? So now you're having some understanding how you're going to do your role play. Um, Questions like that will facilitate so that your client or your counselee will gain insight on how they react or how they behave today. Okay? If for traditional psychoanalysts, usually what happens is that they have this approach, the blank screen approach, meaning to say they don't have self-disclosure or they remain neutral. They remain blank, no? Uh, for the traditional one, this is very important because this is where they will elicit transference. We will talk about this later. That idea of transference, blank screen approach. But for many modern psychoanalysts or psychodynamic theories or practitioners, they are not proposing a blank screen approach because they are seeing now that relationship, now that therapeutic relationship is very important so that healing can happen to the client. Okay, because that relationship itself can be a source, no, of analysis in analyzing how your client relates with you. Okay, whether you are whatever kind of relationship comes out of that. Now you work through that, you process that relationship. Okay. So, for the traditional, the analyst stands outside of the relationship while commenting on it and developing interpretations to foster insight. Have you seen movies na yung counselor nakaupo and then the counselor is lying on the couch and the counselor is at the back. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, you are outside of that relationship. Okay, distant. Why? Because as a therapist, in the same manner, among psychodynamic modern psychodynamic practitioners, in the same manner, the traditional also expects transference, in which the client projects or transfers feelings from past experiences, relationships onto the analyst. I'll talk about this later in detail. Okay. Focus on identifying the unconscious and resistance. What what are the things that show your client is resisting? When you offer insights or interpretations, do you see your client resisting or saying, or maybe saying, no, I don't understand that. No, I don't believe that. Okay. That's why timing is important now, because sometimes our client may not be ready yet to accept our interpretation. And when they are not ready yet, it can backfire. Okay, so timing is important here, so that they will have an insight. Maybe later, their defenses would go down. Okay, they will not be more reactive, and they will be more open to your suggestions, your interpretations. And once you interpret things, then they are more receptive to that, and they begin to see the connection of your interpretation. So remember, as a therapist, your interpretation is powerful. You are in control, actually. No? You are more um, in a powerful situation here because you can interpret your client's issues. No? In other psychotherapies or models, they are not, they don't believe in this approach. Okay, we'll get there, no? Especially when we go to the next models, no? So you understand where the others are reacting to these concepts. Okay, resistance. Change depends on the client's readiness for change and less on accuracy of analyst interpretation. As I was saying, if they are ready and more receptive to your interpretation, then they will be able to gain more insight and understand why they are behaving in a certain manner. So, what is the client's experience in therapy? It's an intensive and long term. No, imagine if you're working with someone who has a lot of issues and always defensive, no, and uses a lot of defense mechanisms, no, that will take time, no, for him to gain insight about his behavior, no? Yung readiness niya, it will take a lot of time for him to understand that, okay? So kaya ito yung ganitong traditional approach, it will take lots of session for them to fully comprehend the meaning of their behavior or their issues in life. Lying on a couch during sessions is traditional. That's what I was talking about. Make a commitment with analysts. No major changes during analysis, and termination is mutual. Okay, this is an example of how this therapeutic approach is applied. Okay, uh, let's go further on how we will understand these techniques and this approach. Again, I will invite you to think in advance how you are going to play this out in your 5 minute role play. Okay, in psychoanalytic techniques, there is what we call that maintaining the analytic framework. What is this maintaining that analytic framework? It follows some techniques, some framework, and it's a whole range of procedural and stylistic factors, like how you do your. There is this constancy in doing like you have to finish early, you have to start on time and end on time. In the same manner, you keep that fixed and regular. No? You're trying to recreate a pattern here, a pattern where the client will see that you will be able to help your client to go back in a similar situation in their past. Well, they will understand, no, like that there is that pattern, like feeding pattern, no, and they will be able to one day, because of that analytic framework that you maintain, they will try to project or have that transference and begin to see you as another father or mother figure. In that way, you can utilize that experience in interpreting why he is behaving that way. And so, when he goes back to the past, he will understand, okay, now why? I feel so comfortable talking to you, my counselor, because I see the good qualities that you have as related to the good qualities of my parents. Or why am I reacting negatively to you? Because I see my parent in you. Or why am I reacting against my formator? Someone who is in authority, because I have authority issues, no, which are not resolved. No? Issues that I was not able to resolve when I was young, and now they are coming out. So this maintaining this analytic framework will provide uh, that structure so that these things will come out. Okay. Free association. I talked about free association. You can use this technique in your role play. You can use this. Again, what happens there? The counselor will start interpreting what you answer, no? And see the connections there. Napaka-powerful ng therapist, no? Kasi he can interpret that as to how he would like to interpret that, no? Okay? And then once you interpret that, and we'll see how these things, your answers are related to your past experiences, no? That's why if you are a psychoanalytic therapist, you take notes, no? You begin to see the connections of the many symbols that you get derived from your client. and the many disclosures that you get from your client, and observe also his defense mechanisms. As a therapist, you have to be aware of this, because this will be part of your interpretation. Okay, you will analyze all of them and come up with an interpretation so that once you offer that to your client, he will gain insight. Ah, okay. Okay, now I understand why I behave like this. Now I can understand it all started because my parents never fed me, or they abandoned me when I was young. No, they did not have time for me. And because of that, I'm having issues with trust. I don't trust people. Okay? Now, you see, when you get there, no, your interpretation is, as a therapist, will facilitate that building of insight to your client. So that will be very helpful in making the unconscious conscious. See, the power of interpretation and the power of all these frameworks that you offer, and even your relationship, you can utilize that so that the unconscious will slowly become evident and manifested, so that your client will begin to understand where his behavior or her behavior is coming from. Dream analysis. Now, you use a dream. The therapist uses the dream to bring the unconscious material to light, the latent content, the hidden symbolic and unconscious motives or wishes. And there is a manifest content in your dream, the more acceptable content, how the dream appears to the dreamer. No? May mga iba, no, they are too symbolic that you don't understand. Okay? But there are also some that are very, very obvious. No? It speaks of like your own past experiences. So that is the manifest content. Okay. So I am not familiar with how dream analysis is being used, but just the same, I would just like to give an example how this could be utilized in interpreting the issues of your client. Okay. Analysis and interpretation of resistance, and analysis and interpretation of transference. We'll get there. I'll talk about that more in detail. Transference, what is this? This concept is very important to understand. The client reacts to the therapist as he did to an earlier significant other. This allows the client to experience feelings that would otherwise be inaccessible. Unconscious repetition of the past into the present. What happens here? Sometimes, if you go back, that's why it's so important to understand the pattern of behavior of your client. Um, Transference is something like that. For example, you as a therapist, then you see that your client uh, would always get jealous if, for example, you start seeing other clients. That is a very good material now. There is now that transference happening, that your client is feeling jealous, projecting that onto you. And then when you look back, actually, this is what's happening every time that person gets close to someone. He or she gets so jealous all the time. Okay. And then you go back and go back. No? There's that repetition always. No? And that gives you an idea that his reaction to you is not only to you, but even people in the past in the same manner. So you can use that transference. Now, you can analyze that because it will allow you to achieve insight into the influence of the past, how his past experiences somehow have made him behave that way now. So you start to examine earlier relationships, okay, and your client will experience a variety of feelings that have been buried in the unconscious. And awareness helps client work to change patterns of behavior. When that there is that awareness now, the client will be able to understand and can start working on to change its pattern. No? Magiging less siguro jealous na siya. And work through old conflicts that keeps client fixated and stunts emotional growth. So once you begin that understanding that transference, yung mga issue niya na naipoproject sa'yo, na-attach sa'yo as a counselor, then you have that material to use. You can use this in your role play. No? Like when you ask your client, I observe that we are, or something like, how are we today now? How is your relationship with me? You can ask that question. And then immediately your client will say, I feel so close to you. Yes, I've been observing that. You become more comfortable to me. And then your client will start saying, yes, actually, I feel also jealous whenever you see others. They come to you and I see they come to you. I'm so jealous. Then you start asking them, is this also an experience in the past that similar that happened to you? And more likely you will discover, no, especially when you have a client who's very open, that they had similar in the past, that they relate in the same manner how they relate to you. Okay? So you can analyze it and use that to offer insight to your client how this pattern of behavior is affecting them. Okay, countertransference, what does this mean? It's the reaction of the therapist toward the client that may interfere with objectivity. What does that mean? If transference is the reaction of the client, countertransference now is your reaction to your client. Now, there are times now you don't like or you are reacting negatively, and that is blocking your relationship with that client. Then you have to see, to also maybe start processing yourself. As a psychoanalyst, you can begin to ask yourself, why am I reacting to this? Or in a similar manner, maybe in the past you had the same experiences also. Or maybe when you were young, you had your own issues as well. That is why now you are reacting to your client. So to help this, it's important also that you undergo, for psychoanalysts, it's important you undergo processing as well. Okay, so that you will have an idea uh, where you also as well is coming from. However, countertransference reactions are not always negative. No? It could speak of something like you will have an idea when you react to that person, more likely, no? In a realistic way, baka yung ibang tao in the same manner are reacting to that person because there is really something wrong with your client, and your reaction is not isolated. No? Okay, so that will also give you an idea on how others are affected by your client. Okay, so these are the concepts of transference, countertransference, resistance. Anything that works against the progress of therapy and prevents the production of unconscious material, that's resistance. Blocks threatening material from entering awareness. Therapist points out resistance and clients must confront it in order to manage the conflict realistically. Okay, because our goal is to make the unconscious conscious. No? Then you start interpreting and analyzing the behavior of your client, and then you offer your interpretation. What happens? When your client starts to not accept them, when your client becomes defensive, then there is that resistance. And so that is blocking your client from gaining insight to his behavior because he could not accept them yet. Okay, so that's why it's also important to point this out to your client. You can say, I notice that you are resisting every time I tell you this. No? I notice that you get angry when I give this interpretation. Where is that coming from? Again, help your client to understand that his behavior now is not only due to the present situation. His behavior now could be traced back to his past experiences. That's why he's behaving this way. So offer that again as an interpretation. Okay, interpret that resistance so that finally one day he'll be ready to accept that. And once he's ready to accept that and begins to have insight, then he become freer. Then you become effective in your therapy. Okay? I hope you're getting the idea now. No? Of course, when you do your role play, mm, you don't, you don't. I don't expect that you put all of these concepts there, but at least try to use some of this. Okay? On how you can portray that. So when you analyze resistance, let me go back to my slide. You help the client to see for example, they keep on canceling appointments. Okay, maybe there is that anxiety, no, that fear of seeing you. When they always cancel, uh, take note, no, that your therapeutic relationship with your client is a material for you to understand the issues of your client. Okay, take note of that. Your relationship with the person is a material for you to understand their issues in life. If they keep on canceling appointments, maybe that could speak of they don't want to see because they're afraid of you. Okay. Maybe there is that authority figure in you that reminds them. Then you can point that out. Like, for example, you know what? I noticed that you always miss your appointment or you are late. What is happening there? And then maybe they start saying that he's afraid of you. Okay. And begin to see the pattern of that fear. I'm sure your client is not only that's not his only first experience of fear. There could be similar figures in the past that he was afraid of, and you are triggering that. So that pattern of behavior, and begin ask your client, in the past, did you experience this? Yeah. Then he started asking questions. When you were young, to whom were you afraid of? Oh, I was afraid of my father because he's very strict. Uh-huh. Then you see the connection now. Do you see your father in me? Maybe you see me as strict because I always keep the time. I always look stern and serious. Probably you see your father in me. That is your interpretation. And then your client may say, ah, yes, I think so. Then what happens? He becomes more accepting. Your interpretation is finally being accepted by your client. Okay? There are limitations to the classical psychoanalysis. What are they? This approach may not be appropriate for all cultures or socioeconomic groups. I don't think you'll be able to apply this to people in the rural areas or those who are timid or those who are not used to disclosing or sharing. I think it would be very difficult. Okay. So that is a setback. It may be not some. I think this will work more for cultures who are more confrontational. Okay, who are more want there is that level of um, comfortability in terms of disclosing, and some cultures are not into that. Okay, deterministic focus does not emphasize current maladaptive behaviors. What does that mean? No, not I. It's not always about id. It is not always about the pleasure principle. No? There are other things that could be affecting the current behaviors. No? Uh, so next, it goes to the other one that we minimize the role of the environment. Why? Because the focus so much on our human behavior is based so much on our biological instincts. What about the environment? Do they affect us? And somehow we're seeing that different environments play a big role in our behavior. It is not only our biological needs, okay? And requires subjective interpretation. This is very subjective. It's hard to be objective here, especially because now the same with the client and also with the therapist. The therapist will be interpreting it according to his interpretation, but can we cross-check that whether that has some objectivity or could that be accurate? That would be difficult. No, it will be difficult to see how accurate our interpretations are because their interpretations they are very subjective. Okay, relies heavily on client fantasy. Okay, so masyadong yeah, yung fantasy could be made up or could be because when it's fantasy, it's hard to investigate. No? How will you examine the accuracy of all these fantasies? And do they really have connections to the present human behavior? Okay, and lengthy treatment may not be practical or affordable for many clients. In the West, when they practice this, it will require a series of sessions, and that will be very expensive. Okay, and it takes a lot of time, some even more than a year or two. Now, when you apply, especially the traditional one. Okay, so these are some of the limitations. So I hope I was able to offer some clarity on how we understand this approach and start conceptualizing how you are going to do your role plays. So if you have any questions, I will see you next week in our class. So get ready with your questions so that you'll be able to prepare for your role play and also for your quiz. Thank you very much and have a good day.